The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 2 by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 10, Side 2. Nearly all the guilds of the 11th century were merchant guilds. They included only independent merchants and master workmen. They excluded all persons dependent upon others. They were frankly institutions in restraint of trade. They usually persuaded their towns to keep out, by a high protective tariff or elsewise, goods competitive with their own. Such alien goods, if allowed to enter the town, were sold at prices fixed by the affected guild. In many cases a merchant guild obtained from commune or king a local or national monopoly in its line or field. The Paris Company for the Transit of Merchandise by Water almost owned the Seine. By city ordinance or economic pressure, the guild usually compelled craftsmen to work only for the guild or with its consent, and to sell its products only to or through the guild. The greater guilds became powerful corporations. They dealt in a variety of goods, purchased raw materials wholesale, provided insurance against losses, organized the food supply and sewage disposals of their towns, paved streets, built roads and docks, deepened harbors, policed highways, supervised markets, regulated wages, hours, conditions of labor, terms of apprenticeship, methods of production and sale, prices of materials and wares. 4 or 5 times a year they fixed a just price that in their judgment gave fair stimulus and reward to all parties concerned. They weighed, tested, counted all products bought or sold in their trade and area, and did their best to keep inferior or dishonest goods from the market. They banded together to resist robbers, feudal lords and tolls, refractory workmen, tax-levying governments. They took a leading part in politics, dominated many municipal councils, effectively supported the communes in their struggles against barons, bishops, and kings, and themselves evolved into an oppressive oligarchy of merchants and financiers. Usually each guild had its own guild hall, which in the later Middle Ages might be architecturally ornate. It had a complex personnel of presiding aldermen, recorders, treasurers, bailiffs, sergeants. It had its own courts to try its members, and required its members to submit their disputes to the guild court before resorting to state law. It obligated its members to help a fellow guildsman in sickness or distress, to rescue or ransom him if attacked or jailed. It supervised the morals, manners, and dress of its members, and fixed a penalty for coming to meetings stockingless. When 2 members of the Leicester Merchants' Guild engaged in fisticuffs at Boston Fair, their fellows fined them a barrel of beer, to be cooperatively drunk by the guild. Each guild had an annual feast for its patron saint, when a brief prelude of prayer sanctioned a day of moist exuberance. It shared in financing and adorning the city's churches or cathedral, and in preparing and performing those miracle plays which mothered the modern drama. And in municipal parades its dignitaries marched in gorgeous liveries, displaying the banners of their trade in colorful pageantry. It provided for its members insurance against fire, flood, theft, imprisonment, disability, and old age. It built hospitals, almshouses, orphanages, and schools. It paid for the funerals of its dead, and for the masses that would rescue their souls from purgatory. Its prosperous descendants seldom failed to remember it in their wills. Normally excluded from these merchant guilds, and yet subject to their economic regulations and political power, the craftsmen in each industry began in the 12th century to form in each town their own craft guilds. In 1099 we find guilds of weavers in London, Lincoln, and Oxford, and soon afterward of fullers, tanners, butchers, goldsmiths. Under the names of arti, zunfte, métier, companies, mysteries, they spread throughout Europe in the 13th century. Venice had 58, Genoa 33, Florence 21, Cologne 26, Paris 100. About 1254, Etienne Boileau, provost of merchants, secretary of commerce, under Louis IX, issued an official livre des métiers, or book of trades, giving the rules and regulations of 101 Paris guilds. The division of labor in this list is astonishing. In the leather industry, for example, there were separate unions for skinners, tanners, cobblers, harness-makers, saddlers, and makers of fine leather goods. In carpentry there were distinct unions of chest-makers, cabinet-makers, boat-builders, wheelwrights, coopers, twiners. Each guild jealously guarded its craft secrets, fenced in its field of work against outsiders, and engaged in lively jurisdictional disputes. In the spirit of the times, the craft guild took a religious form and a patron saint, and aspired to monopoly. Ordinarily, no one might follow a craft unless he belonged to its guild. The guild leaders were annually elected by full assemblies of their craft, but were often chosen by seniority and wealth. Guild regulations determined, as far as merchant guilds, municipal ordinances, and economic law would allow, the conditions under which the members worked, the wages they received, the prices they charged. Guild rules limited the number of masters in an area and of apprentices to a master, forbade the industrial employment of women except the master's wife, or of men after 6 p.m., and punished members for unjust charges, dishonest dealing, and shoddy goods. In many cases, the guild proudly stamped its products with its trademark or hallmark, referring to the guild hall, certifying their quality. The Cloth Guild of Bruges expelled from the city a member who had forged the Bruges hallmark on inferior goods. Competition among masters in quantity of production or price of product was discouraged, lest the cleverest or hardest masters become too rich at the expense of the rest. But competition in quality of product was encouraged among both masters and towns. Craft, like merchant guilds, built hospitals and schools, provided diverse insurance, succored poor members, dowered their daughters, buried the dead, cared for widows, gave labor as well as funds to building cathedrals and churches, and pictured their craft operations and insignia in cathedral glass. The fraternal spirit among the masters did not prevent a sharp gradation of membership and powers in the craft guilds. At the bottom was the apprentice, 10 to 12 years old, bound by his parents for a period of from 3 to 12 years to live with a master workman and serve him in shop and home. In return he received food, clothing, shelter, and instruction in the trade. In the later years of his service, wages and tools. At the end of his term, a gift of money to start him on his own. If he ran away, he was to be returned to his master and punished. If he continued to abscond, he was forever debarred from the craft. On completing his service, he became a journeyman, or serviteur, garçon, compagnon, varlet, passing from one master to another as a day, or journée, laborer. After 2 or 3 years, the journeyman, if he had enough capital to open his own shop, was examined for technical ability by a board of his guild. If he passed, he was made a master. Sometimes, but only in the later Middle Ages, the candidate was required to submit to the governors of the guild a masterpiece, a satisfactory sample of his craft. The graduate craftsman or master owned his tools and usually produced goods directly on order of the consumer, who in some cases provided the materials and might at any time come in and watch the work. The middleman in this system did not control the avenues between the maker and the user of goods. The scale of the craftsman's operations was limited by the market for which he produced, which was usually his town, but he was not dependent upon the fluctuations of a general market or the mood of distant investors or purchasers. He did not know the economic paranoia of alternating exaltations and depressions. His hours were long, 8 to 13 hours a day, but he chose them himself, worked in a wisely, leisurely way, and enjoyed many a religious holiday. He ate nourishing food, bought sturdy furniture, wore simple but durable clothing, and had at least as wide a cultural life as the master workman of today. He did not read much and was spared much stupefying trash, but he shared actively in the song and dance, the drama and ritual of his community. Throughout the 13th century, the craft guilds waxed in number and power and provided a democratic check on the oligarchic merchant guilds. But the craft guilds in turn became an aristocracy of labor. They tended to restrict mastership to masters' sons. They underpaid their journeymen, who in the 14th century weakened them with repeated revolt, and they raised ever higher barriers against entry into their membership or their towns. They were excellent organizations for an industrial age when difficulties of transportation often narrowed the market to local buyers, and capital accumulations were not yet sufficiently rich and fluid to finance large-scale undertakings. When such funds appeared, the guilds, merchant or craft, lost control of the market and therefore the conditions of work. The Industrial Revolution destroyed them in England by the slow fatality of economic change, and the French Revolution abruptly disbanded them as hostile to that freedom and dignity of work that for a bright moment they had once sustained. 6. The communes. The economic revolution of the 12th and 13th centuries, like those of the 18th and the 20th, caused a revolution in society and government. New classes rose to economic and political power, and gave to the medieval city that virile and pugnacious independence which culminated in the Renaissance. The question of heredity versus environment affects the cities as well as the guilds of Europe. Were they the lineal descendants of Roman municipalities, or new concretions deposited by the stream of economic change? Many Roman cities maintained their continuity through centuries of chaos, poverty, and decay, but only a few in Italy and southeastern France kept the old Roman institutions, and fewer still the old Roman law. North of the Alps, barbarian laws had overlaid the Roman heritage, and in some measure the political customs of the German tribe or village had seeped even into ancient municipalities. Most transalpine towns belonged to feudal domains and were ruled by the will and appointees of their feudal lords. Municipal institutions were alien, feudal institutions natural to the Teutonic conquerors. Outside of Italy, the medieval city rose through the formation of new commercial centers, classes, and powers. The feudal town had grown up, usually on elevations, at the junction of roads or along vital waterways or on frontiers. Around the walls of the feudal castle or fortified monastery, the modest industry and trade of the townsmen or burgesses had slowly developed. When Norse and Magyar raids subsided, this extramural activity expanded, shops multiplied, and merchants and craftsmen, once transient, became settled residents of the town. In war, however, insecurity returned, and the extramural population built a second wall of wider circumference than the feudal moat to protect itself, its shops, and its goods. The feudal baron or bishop still owned and ruled this enlarged town as part of his domain, but its growing population was increasingly commercial and secular, fretted under feudal tolls and controls, and plotted to win municipal liberty. Out of old political traditions and new administrative needs, an assembly of citizens and a corps of officials took form, and more this commune, the body politic, regulated the affairs of the city, the body geographical. Towards the end of the 11th century, the merchant leaders began to demand from the feudal overlords charters of communal freedom for the towns. With characteristic shrewdness, they played one overlord against the other, baron against bishop, knight against baron, king against any of them or all. The townsmen used diverse means to achieve municipal freedom. They took a solemn oath to refuse and resist baronial or episcopal tolls or taxes. They offered the lord a flat sum or an annuity for a charter. On the royal domain they won autonomy by money grants or services in war. Sometimes they bluntly announced their independence and fought a violent revolution. Tours fought 12 times before its liberty was won. Lords in need or debt, especially in preparing for a crusade, sold charters of self-government to the towns that they held in fief. Many English cities in this way won their local autonomy from Richard I. Some lords, above all in Flanders, granted charters of incomplete freedom to cities whose commercial development enhanced baronial revenues. The abbots and bishops resisted longest, for their consecration oath bound them not to lower the income of their abbeys or sees, by which their many ministrations were financed. Hence the struggle of the towns against their ecclesiastical owners was most bitter and prolonged. The Spanish kings favored the communes as foils to a troublesome nobility, and the royal charters were many and liberal. Leon received its charter from the King of Castile in 1020, Burgos in 1073, Nájera in 1076, Toledo in 1085, and Compostela, Cadiz, Valencia, Barcelona soon followed. In Germany, feudalism, in Italy, the cities, profited from the mutual exhaustion of empire and papacy in the war of investitures and other conflicts between church and state. In northern Italy, the cities attained a political vigor hardly known before or since. As the Alpine streams fed the great rivers of Lombardy and Tuscany in commerce and fertilized the plains, so the commerce of Transalpine Europe and Western Asia, meeting in northern Italy, generated there a mercantile bourgeoisie, whose wealth rebuilt old cities, raised up new ones, financed literature and art, and proudly cast off feudal bonds. The nobility from their castles in the countryside fought a losing war against the communal movement. Yielding, they took up residence in the city and swore loyalty to the commune. The bishops, who for centuries had been the real and able governors of the Lombard towns, were subdued with the help of the popes, whose authority they had long ignored. In 1080 we hear of consuls governing Lucca. In 1084 we find them at Pisa, in 1098 at Arezzo, in 1099 at Genoa, in 1105 at Pavia, in 1138 at Florence. The cities of northern Italy continued till the 15th century to acknowledge the formal sovereignty of the empire, and indicted their state papers in its name, but in practice and effect they were free, and the ancient regime of city-state was revived, with all its chaos and stimulus. In France, the enfranchisement of the cities involved a long and often violent struggle. At Le Mans in 1069, Cambrai in 1076, and Reims in 1139, the ruling bishops, by excommunication or force, succeeded in suppressing the communes set up by the citizens. At Noyon, however, the bishop of his own accord gave a charter to the town in 1108. Saint-Quentin freed itself in 1080, Beauvais in 1099, Marseille in 1100, Amiens in 1113. At Laon in 1115, the citizens took advantage of their corrupt bishop's absence to establish a commune. On his return he was bribed to take oath to protect it. A year later he induced King Louis VI to suppress it. In the monk Guibert of Nogent's account of what followed, we sample the intensity of the communal revolution. On the 5th day of Easter week there arose a disorderly noise throughout the city, men shouting, "Commune!" Citizens now entered the bishop's court with swords, battle-axes, bows, hatchets, clubs, and spears, a very great company. The nobles rallied from all sides to the bishop. He, with some helpers, fought them off with stones and arrows. He hid himself in a cask, and piteously implored them, promising that he would cease to be their bishop, would give them unlimited riches, and would leave the country. And as they with hardened hearts jeered at him, one named Bernard, lifting his battle-axe, brutally dashed out the brains of that sacred though sinner's head, and he, slipping between the hands of those who held him, was dead before he reached the ground, stricken by another blow under the eye-sockets and across the nose. There, brought to his end, his legs were cut off, and many another wound inflicted. Thibault, seeing a ring on the bishop's finger, and not being able to draw it off, cut off the finger. The cathedral was fired and was razed to the ground. Thinking to take 2 steps at once, the pillagers began to sack and burn the mansions of the aristocracy. A royal army stormed the city and joined nobles and clergy in massacring the population. The commune was suppressed. 14 years later it was restored, and the citizens labored with pious enthusiasm to rebuild the cathedral that they or their fathers had destroyed. The struggle continued for a century. At Vézelay in 1106 the people killed Abbot Arnaud and set up a commune. Orléans rose in 1137 but failed. Louis VII granted Sens a charter in 1146, but revoked it 3 years later on petition of the abbot within whose domains the city lay. The populace killed the abbot and his nephew, but failed to re-establish the commune. The Bishop of Tournai fought a civil war for 6 years, from 1190 to 1196, to overthrow the commune. The Pope excommunicated all the citizens. On Easter Sunday of 1194 the people of Rouen sacked the houses of the cathedral canons. In 1207 the city was put under a papal interdict. In 1235 at Reims the stones brought into the city to rebuild the cathedral were seized by the populace and were used for missals and barricades in a revolt against the highest ecclesiastic in Gaul. He and his canons fled and did not return until 2 years later, when the Pope induced Louis VII to abolish the commune. Many cities of France never succeeded till the Revolution in establishing their freedom, but in North France most of the cities were freed between 1080 and 1200, and under the stimulus of liberty entered upon their greatest age. It was the communes that built the Gothic cathedrals. In England, the kings won the support of the cities against the nobility by granting them charters of limited self-government. William the Conqueror gave such a charter to London. Similar charters were yielded by Henry II to Lincoln, Durham, Carlisle, Bristol, Oxford, Salisbury, and Southampton. And in 1201 Cambridge bought its communal rights from King John. In Flanders, the ruling counts made substantial concessions to Ghent, Bruges, Douai, Tournai, Lille, but overcame all attempts at complete municipal independence. Leiden, Haarlem, Rotterdam, Dordrecht, Delft, and other Dutch cities obtained charters of local autonomy in the 13th century. In Germany, the liberation was long drawn out, and mostly peaceful. The bishops, who had for centuries ruled the cities as feudatories of the emperors, yielded to Cologne, Trier, Metz, Mainz, Speyer, Strasbourg, and Worms, and other cities, the right to select their own magistrates and make their own laws. By the end of the 12th century, the communal revolution was won in Western Europe. The cities, though seldom completely free, had thrown off their feudal masters, ended or reduced feudal tolls, and severely limited ecclesiastical rights. The Flemish cities forbade the establishment of new monasteries and the bequest of land to churches. They restricted the right of the clergy to be tried by episcopal courts and contested clerical control of primary schools. The mercantile bourgeoisie now dominated municipal and economic life. In nearly all the communes, the merchant guilds were recognized as self-governing bodies. In some cases, the commune and the merchant guild were identical organizations. Usually the two were distinct, but the commune rarely contravened the interests of the guilds. The Lord Mayor of London was chosen by the city guilds. Now, for the first time in 1,000 years, the possession of money became again a greater power than the possession of land. Nobility and clergy were challenged by a rising plutocracy. Even more than in antiquity, the mercantile bourgeoisie turned its wealth, energy, and ability to political advantage. In most cities, it eliminated the poor from assemblies or offices. It oppressed the manual worker and the peasant, monopolized the profits of commerce, taxed the community heavily, and spent much of the revenue in internal strife or in external wars to capture markets and destroy competitors. It tried to suppress artisan associations and refused them the right to strike under penalty of exile or death. Its regulation of prices and wages aimed at its own good to the serious detriment of the working class. As in the French Revolution, the defeat of the feudal lords was a victory chiefly for the business class. Nevertheless, the communes were a magnificent reassertion of human liberty. At the call of the bell from the town campanile, the citizens flocked to assemble and chose their municipal officers. The cities formed their own communal militia, defended themselves lustily, defeated the trained troops of the German emperor at Legnano in 1176, and fought one another to mutual exhaustion. Though the administrative councils soon narrowed their membership to a mercantile aristocracy, the municipal assemblies were the first representative government since Tiberius. They, rather than Magna Carta, were the chief parent of modern democracy. The atavistic relics of feudal or tribal law, compurgations, duels, ordeals, were replaced by the legal and orderly examination of witnesses. The wergild or blood price gave way to fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment. The law's delays were reduced, legal contracts replaced feudal status and loyalties, and a whole new body of business law created a new order in European life. The young democracy leaped at once to a semi-socialistic state-managed economy. The commune minted its own currency, ordered and supervised public works, built roads, bridges, and canals, paved some city streets, organized the food supply, forbade forestalling, engrossing, or regrading, brought seller and buyer into direct contact at markets and fairs, examined weights and measures, inspected commodities, punished adulteration, controlled exports and imports, stored grain for lean years, provided grain at fair prices in emergencies, and regulated the prices of essential foods and beer. When it found that a price set too low discouraged the production of a desirable commodity, it allowed certain wholesale prices to seek their own level through competition, but established courts or assizes of bread and ale to keep the retail price of these necessities in constant relation with the cost of wheat or barley. Periodically it published a list of fair prices. It assumed that for every commodity there must be a just price, combining costs of materials and labor. The theory ignored supply and demand and fluctuations in the value of currency. Some communes, like Basel or Genoa, assumed a monopoly of the trade in salt. Others, like Nuremberg, brewed their own beer or stored corn in municipal granaries. The flow of goods was impeded by municipal protective tariffs, and in some cases by requiring transient merchants to expose their goods for sale in the town before passing through. As in our century, these regulations were often circumvented by the subtlety of refractory citizens. Black markets were numerous. Many of these restrictive ordinances brought more harm than good, and soon ceased to be enforced. But all in all, the work of the medieval communes did credit to the skill and courage of the businessmen who managed them. Under their leadership, Europe experienced in the 12th and 13th centuries such prosperity as it had not known since the fall of Rome. Despite epidemics, famines, and wars, the population of Europe swelled under the communal system as not for 1,000 years before. The population of Europe had begun to decline in the 2nd century, and had probably reached nadir in the 9th century. From the 11th century to the Black Death in 1349, it rose again with the resurrection of commerce and industry. In the region between the Moselle and the Rhine, it probably multiplied tenfold. In France, it may have reached 20 million, hardly less than in the 18th century. The economic revolution involved a migration from country to city almost as definite as in recent times. Constantinople, with 800,000, Cordova and Palermo, with 500,000 each, had long been populous, but before 1100 only a few cities north of the Alps had more than 3,000 souls. By 1200, Paris had some 100,000, Douai, Lille, Ypres, Ghent, Bruges, approximately 50,000 each. London, 20,000. By 1300, Paris had 150,000, Venice, Milan, Florence, 100,000, Siena and Modena, 30,000, Lübeck, Nuremberg, and Cologne, 20,000, Frankfurt, Basel, Hamburg, Norwich, York, 10,000. Of course, all these figures are loose and hazardous estimates. The growth of population was both a result and a cause of the economic development. It came from improved protection of life and property, better exploitation of natural resources through industry, and the wider spread of food and goods through rising wealth and trade. Conversely, it offered an expanding market to commerce and industry, to literature, drama, music, and art. The competitive pride of the communes turned their wealth into cathedrals, city halls, bell towers, fountains, schools, and universities. Civilization crossed seas and mountains in the wake of trade. From Islam and Byzantium it swept over Italy and Spain, and marched over the Alps into Germany, France, Flanders, and Britain. The Dark Ages became a memory, and Europe was alive again with lusty youth. We must not idealize the medieval town. It was picturesque, to the modern eye, with castle-crowned hill and towered wall, with thatched or tiled houses, cottages, and shops crowding gregariously around cathedral, castle, or public square. But for the most part its streets were narrow and tortuous alleys, ideal for defense and shade, where men and beasts moved to the clatter of hoofs and words and wooden shoes, and with the leisureliness of an age that had no machines to spare its muscle and wear its nerves. Around many of the city dwellings were gardens, chicken coops, pig pens, cow pastures, dunghills. London was finicky and decreed that he who will nourish a pig, let him keep it in his own house. Elsewhere the swine rooted freely among the open garbage piles. Every now and then heavy rains swelled the rivers and flooded fields and cities, so that men rowed boats into Westminster Palace. After rain the streets would be muddy for days. Men wore boots then, and fine ladies were borne in carriages or chairs, undulating from hole to hole. In the 13th century some cities paved their main streets with cobblestones. In most cities, however, the streets were unpaved, unsafe for foot or nose. Monasteries and castles had good drainage systems. Cottages usually had none. Here and there were grassy or sandy squares, with a pump from which people might drink and a trough for passing animals. North of the Alps houses were nearly all of wood. Only the richest nobles and merchants built of brick or stone. Fires were frequent and often swept unchecked through a town. In 1188, Rouen, Beauvais, Arras, Troyes, Provins, Poitiers, and Moissac were all destroyed by fire. Rouen was burned down 6 times between 1200 and 1225. Tile roofs became the custom only in the 14th century. Firefighting was by bucket brigades, heroic and incompetent. Watchmen were provided with a long hook to pull down a burning house if it threatened other buildings. Since all wished to live near the castle for security, buildings rose to several stories, sometimes 6, and the upper floors projected charmingly and alarmingly over the street. Towns issued ordinances limiting the height of buildings. Despite these difficulties, hardly felt because felt by nearly all, life could be interesting in the medieval city. Markets were crowded, talk was plentiful, dress and goods were colorful, peddlers cried their wares, craftsmen plied their trades. Strolling players might be performing a miracle or mystery play in the square. A religious procession might pass down the street with proud merchants and sturdy workers marching, and gaudy floats and solemn vestments and stirring song. Some glorious church might be a building. Some pretty lass might lean from a balcony. The town belfry might summon the citizens to meeting or to arms. At sunset curfew rang and bade all people hasten home, for there were no lights in the streets except candles in windows, and here and there a lamp before a shrine. A nocturnal burgher would have his servants precede him with torches or lanterns and arms, for police were rare. The wise citizen retired early, shunning the tedium of illiterate evenings, and knowing that at dawn the noisy cocks would crow and work would clamor to be done. 7. The Agricultural Revolution. The growth of industry and commerce, the spread of a money economy, and the rising demand for labor in the towns transformed the agricultural regime. The municipalities, eager to get new hands, announced that any person living in a town for 366 days without being claimed, identified, and taken as a serf became automatically free and would enjoy the protection of the commune's laws and power. In 1106, Florence invited all the peasants of the surrounding villages to come and live there as freemen. Bologna and other towns paid feudal lords to let their serfs move into the city. A large number of serfs escaped or were invited to open new lands east of the Elbe, where they became automatically free. Those who remained on the manor showed a troublesome resistance to feudal dues long sanctioned by time. Emulating the town guilds, many serfs formed rural associations, confréries, conjurations, and bound themselves by oath to act together in refusing feudal dues. They stole or destroyed seigneurial charters that recorded their bondage or obligations. They burned down the castles of obstinate seigneurs. They threatened to abandon a domain if their demands were not met. In 1100, the villeins of Saint-Michel-de-Beauvais announced that they would thereafter marry any woman they pleased and would give their daughters to any man who pleased them. In 1102, the serfs of Saint-Arnoux-de-Crépy refused their abbot-lord the traditional heriot or death due, or to pay a fine for letting their daughters marry outside the domain. Similar rebellions broke out in a dozen towns from Flanders to Spain. The feudal lords found it increasingly difficult to make a profit out of serf labor. Rising resistance required costly superintendence at every turn. Villain labor in manorial shops proved more expensive and less competent than the free labor that produced like goods in the towns. To keep the peasants on the land and make their labor profitable to himself, the baron commuted the old feudal dues for money payments, sold freedom to serfs who could pay for it with their savings, leased more and more of the domain to free peasants for a money rental, and hired free labor for the workshops on his estate. Year by year, following the lead of the Moslem and Byzantine East, Western Europe from the 11th to the 13th century passed from payments predominantly in kind to payments predominantly in currency. Feudal landlords, desiring the manufactured products that commerce laid before their eyes, craved money with which to purchase them. Going off to the Crusades, they wanted money rather than food and goods. Governments demanded taxes in money, not in kind. The landlords yielded to the course of events and sold their products for cash instead of consuming them by laborious migration from villa to villa. The change to a money economy proved costly for the feudal landlords. The commutations and rents they received acquired the fixity of medieval custom and could not be raised as rapidly as the value of money fell. Many of the aristocracy had to sell their land, usually to the rising bourgeoisie. Some nobles as early as 1250 died landless or destitute. Early in the 14th century, King Philip the Fair of France freed the serfs on the royal domain, and in 1315 his son Louis X ordered the liberation of all serfs on fair and suitable conditions. Gradually, from the 12th to the 16th century, at different times in divers countries west of the Elbe, serfdom gave place to peasant proprietorship. The feudal manor broke up into small estates, and the peasantry rose in the 13th century to a degree of freedom and prosperity that it had not known for 1,000 years. The seigneurial courts lost their jurisdiction over the peasants, and the village community elected its own officers, who swore allegiance not to the local lord, but only to the crown. The emancipation in Western Europe was not quite complete till 1789. Many feudal lords still claimed the old rights in law, and would try in the 14th century to restore them in fact. But the movement toward free and mobile labor could not be stopped so long as commerce and industry grew. The new stimulus of freedom cooperated with an immense widening of the agricultural market to improve the methods, tools, and products of tillage. The rising population of the towns, the increase of wealth, the new facilities of finance and trade expanded and enriched the rural economy. New industries created a demand for industrial crops, sugar cane, aniseed, cumin, hemp, flax, vegetable oils, and dyes. The nearness of populous towns promoted cattle raising, dairy farming, and market gardening. From thousands of vineyards in the valleys of the Tiber, the Arno, the Po, the Guadalquivir, the Tagus, the Ebro, the Rhone, the Gironde, the Garonne, the Loire, the Seine, the Moselle, the Meuse, the Rhine, and the Danube, wine flowed along the rivers and over land and sea to console the toilers of Europe's fields, workshops, and counting rooms. Even England, from the 11th to the 16th century, made wine. To feed the hungry towns, where fast days were numerous and meat was costly, great fleets went out into the Baltic and North Seas to bring in herring and other fish. Yarmouth owed its life to the herring trade. The merchants of Lübeck acknowledged their debt to it by carving herrings on their pews. And honest Dutchmen admitted that they had built upon herrings the proud city of Amsterdam. Agricultural techniques slowly improved. The Christians learned from the Arabs in Spain, Sicily, and the East, and the Benedictine and Cistercian monks brought old Roman and new Italian tricks of farming, breeding, and soil preservation to the countries north of the Alps. The strip system was abandoned in laying out new farms, and each farmer was left to his own initiative and enterprise. In Flanders fields reclaimed from swamps, the peasants of the 13th century practiced a three-field rotation of crops, in which the soil was used each year but was triennially replenished by fodder or leguminous plants. Powerful teams of oxen drew iron plowshares more deeply into the soil than before. Most plows, however, were still, as of 1300, of wood. Only a few regions knew the use of manure, and wagon wheels were seldom shod with iron tires. Cattle raising was difficult because of prolonged droughts, but the 13th century saw the first experiments in the crossing and acclimatization of breeds. Dairy farming was unprogressive. The average cow in the 13th century gave little milk and hardly a pound of butter per week. A well-bred cow now yields 10 to 30 pounds of butter per week. While their masters fought one another, the peasants of Europe fought the greater battle, the more heroic and unsung, of man against nature. Between the 11th and the 13th century, the sea had 35 times swept over barriers and across the lowlands, creating new gulfs and bays where once there had been land, and drowning 100,000 persons in a century. From the 11th to the 14th century, the peasants of these regions, under their princes and abbots, transported blocks of stone from Scandinavia and Germany, and built the Golden Wall, behind which the Belgians and the Dutch have developed two of the most civilized states in history. Thousands of acres were rescued from the sea, and by the 13th century the lowlands were latticed with canals. From 1179 to 1257 the Italians cut the famous Naviglio Grande, or Great Canal, between Lake Maggiore and the Po, fertilizing 86,485 acres of land. Between the Elbe and the Oder, patient immigrants from Flanders, Frisia, Saxony, and the Rhineland turned the marshy Mooren into rich fields. The superabundant forests of France were progressively cleared and became the farms that through centuries of political turmoil have kept France fed. Perhaps it was this mass heroism of clearance, drainage, irrigation, and cultivation, rather than any victories of war or trade, that provided the foundation on which, in final analysis, rest all the triumphs of European civilization in the last 700 years. 8. The Class War. In the early Middle Ages there had been only two classes in Western Europe, German conquerors and native conquered. By and large, the later aristocracies in England, France, Germany, and northern Italy were descendants of the conquerors and remained conscious of this blood relationship even amid their wars. In the 11th century there were three classes, the nobles who fought, the clergy who prayed, and the peasants who worked. The division became so traditional that most men thought it ordained by God, and most peasants, like most nobles, assumed that a man should patiently continue in the class into which he had been born. The economic revolution of the 12th century added a new class, the burgesses, or bourgeoisie, the bakers, merchants, and master craftsmen of the towns. It did not yet include the professions. In France, the classes were called états, estates or states, and the bourgeoisie was reckoned as the tiers état, or third estate. It controlled municipal affairs, and won entry into the English Parliament, the German Diet, the Spanish Cortes, and the States General, the rarely convened national parliament of France. But it had before the 18th century little influence on national policy. The nobles continued to rule and administer the state, though they were now a minor force in the cities. They lived in the country, except in Italy, scorned city dwellers in commerce, ostracized any of their class who married a bourgeois, and were certain that an aristocracy of birth is the only alternative to a plutocracy of business, or a theocracy of myths, or a despotism of arms. Nevertheless, the wealth that came from commerce and industry began now to compete, and in the 18th century would surpass, the wealth that came from the ownership of land. The rich merchants fretted over aristocratic heirs and scorned and exploited the craftsman class. They lived in ornate mansions, bought fine furniture, ate exotic foods, and garbed themselves in costly dress. Their wives covered expanding forms with silks and furs, velvets and jewelry, and Jeanne of Navarre, Queen of France, was piqued to find herself welcomed into Bruges by 600 bourgeois ladies as gorgeously robed as herself. The nobles complained and demanded sumptuary laws to check this insolent display. Such laws were periodically passed, but as the kings needed bourgeois support and funds, these laws were only spasmodically enforced. The rapid growth of urban population favored the bourgeois owners of city realty, and the consequent unemployment made it easier to manage the manual working class. The proletariat of servants, apprentices, and journeymen had little education and no political power, and lived in a poverty sometimes more dismal than the serfs. A 13th-century day laborer in England received some 2 pence per day, roughly equivalent in purchasing power to $2 in the United States of America in 1948. A carpenter received 4 1/8 pence, or $4.12 per day. A mason 3 1/8, an architect 12 pence, plus traveling expenses and occasional gifts. Prices, however, were commensurately low. In England, in 1300, a pound of beef cost a farthing, or 21 cents. A fowl 1 penny, or 84 cents. A quarter of wheat 5 shillings 9 1/2 pence, or $57.90. The workday began at dawn and ended at dusk, sooner on the eve of Sunday or a feast day. There were some 30 feast days in the year, but in England probably not more than 6 exempted the people from toil. The hours were a bit longer, the real wages no worse, some would say higher, than in 18th or 19th century England. Toward the end of the 13th century, the class struggle became class war. Every generation saw some revolt of the peasantry, particularly in France. In 1251, the oppressed peasantry of France and Flanders rose against their secular and ecclesiastical landlords. Calling themselves pastoureux, or shepherds, they formed a kind of revolutionary crusade under the lead of an unlicensed preacher known as the Master of Hungary. They marched from Flanders through Amiens to Paris. Discontented peasants and prolétaires joined them en route until they numbered over 100,000 men. They bore religious banners and proclaimed devotion to King Louis IX, then a prisoner of the Moslems in Egypt, but they were ominously armed with clubs, daggers, axes, pikes, and swords. They denounced the corruption of government, the tyranny of the rich over the poor, the covetous hypocrisy of priests and monks, and the populace cheered their denunciations. They assumed the ecclesiastical rights of preaching, granting absolution and performing marriages, and slew some priests who opposed them. Passing on to Orleans, they massacred scores of clergy and university students. But there and at Bordeaux the police overcame them, their leaders were captured and executed, and the wretched survivors of the futile march were hunted like dogs and dispersed into divers haunts of misery. Some escaped to England and raised a minor peasant uprising, which was in turn suppressed. In the industrial towns of France, the craft guilds rose in repeated strikes or armed insurrection against the political and economic monopoly and dictation of the merchant class. This book is continued on Cassette 11, Side 1.